From the EPR Creation Studios, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, well, I should say as whenever we're recording, because it's been 6 months, but as always, otherwise, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price, by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Information about all these sponsors in the show notes as usual. Supporting them helps support the podcast, so very much appreciated for those of you who have done so. All right, well, it is July, which makes it past time to go ahead and get back in the saddle. We're now firmly in the preseason territory, in the season preview territory, and it's time to get back going. I'm not even going to get into the reasons for taking the layoff that I did on this, but suffice to say that, honestly, in terms of actual Florida State news, I don't think there was a whole lot lost in that 6 months. But today's show, in some sense, is going to be a little bit of a catch-up, talking about some of the things that have happened since then. Obviously, spring practice happened. I don't think there was a whole lot of major developments to come out of that, except that we know more about sort of where the personnel is and some of the additions that they brought onto campus, and have a little bit better sense of what might happen with this roster coming into this next year. But really, most of the discussion points have been off-field creation of, the stuff surrounding the sport and media coverage and all sorts of things like that. And actually, about the closest I've been to coming back into the studio and doing some recording over the last few months was May, June area, where I was starting to notice more and more just of the Florida State beat, the stuff that would get put into my social media timelines when I get a chance to take a peek on that stuff. Just seeing the amount of negativity and the adversarial relationship that basically has developed in Tallahassee between media and the coaching staff here. I got close to coming back in and doing something then. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that now. And to some degree, I think you could characterize sort of spring football through June, or through at least early June, as Florida State media versus Mike Norvell in some sense. And to some degree, Florida State social media versus Mike Norvell and the Florida State coaching staff. And, honestly, I'm at a point where I'm, full disclosure, I mean, this is stepping away from really media coverage side of things to more of a personal side of things in this regard. And, you all know that I've got long-standing connections to Florida State, and as an alum, as a former quote-unquote player, I was really more of a practice dummy for the couple years that I was there doing that. But I obviously want to see my alma mater and former program do well. There's no doubt about that. But there's actually more to it than that now, because in all honesty, I kind of want to see Mike Norvell I want to see him turn things around and then get the opportunity to kind of rub the faces of some of these folks in it a little bit. Because honestly, I think some of the sorts of discussions that have been had have been kind of below the belt. And one of the reflections that I've had on this is, I wonder, is any other team's media, any other program's media, so invested in this kind of contentious relationship with the program that they cover? And I imagine that this is not unique to Florida State. It's probably a a consequence or a factor of being one of the elite programs in the country with the highest, with among the highest expectations and all of that, and being in a down cycle for a good while now. I also suspect, and I think that this is really the bigger thing. I think actually, this is sort of the price of a packed and very competitive media landscape for Florida State in particular. I mean, I think actually Florida State may have the most competitive team coverage media environment of any team in college football, of any program in college football. I mean, you think about how spoiled Florida State fans have been with the coverage of the program and the different avenues that have been present in and around the Florida State program for decades now. I mean, this goes back to the Osceola, to the old, and I'm dating myself here, Seminole Territory website, which was back in the early 90s, which then sort of became the Territory and then gave birth to what became warchant.com, and then eventually Knoll Digest, which I ran for a while over on the Scout Network. Then you've got the Knowles 24/7, you've got Tomahawk Nation, you've got the Knollcast, you've got this podcast, which has been running for 12 years now, and a whole host of other outlets. And I mean, there's a lot of resources that have been devoted to coverage of this program. And you think about the size of fan sites and all of that. Florida State is punched above its weight in that respect for a long time. And I think there's been more competition within that space in the Florida State orbit than there has been at a lot of other places. So I suspect that that's actually one of the artifacts of that, is that you do get more competition to break news, more competition to feel like to make sure that everybody knows that you're the one that's the realist, that you're the one that's going to spit the facts as opposed to those guys over there. I've never really been interested in that kind of competitive approach to all of this. I'm not someone who's made a ton of effort to break news, even when I've had on the rare occasions that I've had news before others broke it. But there's been sort of a competitive aspect of this, and I understand it. There's a lot of money involved in these sorts of things. And anytime you get that kind of money, anytime you get that kind of competition, certain other incentives come into play. And, then you end up with things like the Amarius Mims thing being broken before it should have been, and then that potentially costing Florida State quite a bit. There's a whole host of things that have happened over the years that have been a factor here. But you think about how quickly the Florida State media turned on Jimbo Fisher. Willie Taggart was a kind of a special case because I think, that was kind of a disaster from the beginning. Anybody who was around sort of on the inside on that knows that. But, Mike Norvell, within 6 months of going 13-0, 8 months of going 13-0, all of a sudden things were already turning. And within a year, I mean, you're looking at stuff that just, wow. And even when Norvell's had a lot of success, you've gotten a ton of harping on recruiting. And I get it. I mean, I do think that the last staff under Norvell, and to some degree, Norvell being responsible for this, did underachieve in terms of high school recruiting. I don't think there's any question about that. I do think also, though, that in the environment that Norvell took over the program, and given the headwinds that he had, that was a unique circumstance for him, and were headwinds that I don't think any other coach in the country has really faced to that degree. You're coming off of Willie Taggart, and then you take over, and it's immediately COVID, and you're not even allowed to go onto the road and evaluate. You can't build the relationships across the state that you initially would have with the new coach smell. By the time all that's done and you're able to do that, the new coach smell is worn off. You're still dealing with being in a down cycle and all of that. I mean, it's just a completely different situation. So I understand that, but I do think that there were things that they could have done better. And I think if you asked Norvell himself, he'd say that. But the thing that has sort of struck me about a lot of this is the degree to which certain elements of focusing on high school recruiting and all of this has been done in a way that actually has fed into negative recruiting narratives by those on the outside of the program, by other programs. And you say, well, geez, like, even if you do hold to, some critiques of this, I wonder, I just wonder about how this has actually been handled by some of the folks in the media. And maybe the most egregious example of this in the last few months was the backlash to the commitment of Cameron Brooks, a defensive end, outside linebacker, edge prospect, and I would say project, from Thomas County in South Georgia, when he committed to Cal, ostensibly over Florida State, Georgia, and the rest. And that being one where a bunch of media were just shocked by this. And he's, 37, 38 miles away from the Florida State campus. So not very far. And it's like, you're losing a guy in your own backyard to Cal, of all places. Cal? Really? Cal? And then later on, Brooks did an interview and made some comments about how Florida State really didn't communicate very much with him until he committed to Cal. And then they kind of seemed to want to get back into it, but he really didn't hear from them a whole lot. And that led to significant discussion from Florida State media, basically saying, look, Florida State staff is clearly just lazy. They don't communicate with players the way that they should. And, this staff is just not very good at recruiting. Well, here's the thing. First of all, this staff is a new staff, so it's a little early for any of us to assess that. Second of all, maybe the Florida State staff just doesn't think as much of Cam Brooks as the recruiting industry does, and the sites that cover Florida State do, and as Cam Brooks himself does, which I think is the case. I just don't think he was very high on their board, so they didn't really emphasize him. And here's the thing: one of the tricky parts about recruiting is that if you overemphasize, or let's say you over communicate and you overemphasize how much interest you have in a guy who's 30 miles, 37, 38 miles from your campus, and he's not super high on your board, but you kind of have him as a fallback, like plan C or something like that. The danger is that you go too far in on him, and then he's trying to commit early on because, he's in your backyard, and then you're kind of stuck. You're stuck either saying, wait, no, son, we're really not at that point in our relationship yet for this kind of commitment, in which case you may really offend a kid and lose him that way, and, have to deal with some of the effects of that. Or you're stuck potentially taking a kid that maybe you wouldn't have taken otherwise. And so, that's always difficult. But the fact that Florida State did not land a commitment from Cam Brooks is not disastrous. I mean, I've seen the kid's junior film, and unless he has a major breakout as a senior, he wouldn't have been near the top of my board. So, I mean, what do you really expect at that point? I think it makes a lot of sense that kind of it has gone the way that it has. And here's the thing. If you do kind of put a little bit less effort in at this point, and then he just takes a quantum leap forward and lights it up and displays first rate, moves up your board skill in his senior film, he's 37 miles away. Maybe you turn up the intensity at that point, and you make your apologies and maybe up the bid. You do what's necessary to land him, and it's probably easier to do so. I think that's probably the thinking there. Now, either way, Florida State got raked over the coals over this. And yet, the real irony about that is that after these dire assessments in May and early June, that this staff just They just can't recruit, and they're not going to recruit, and therefore they're dead men walking, et cetera, et cetera. They went on an absolute commitment tear through the second half of June, or basically last 3 weeks of June, first week of July, adding several blue chip players in quick succession at key positions. Now, I'm not as high on O'Neal at quarterback as many are. I'm not a big fan of his throwing motion. He's not as accurate as I'd like to see at this stage of his development. There are some limitations there that you're going to have to deal with. But he does have a strong arm, and there's some things to work with there. And at any rate, I think you have to roll the dice in terms of the quarterback recruiting game, if for nothing else than than the impact of that on your overall recruiting class. I think that's important. And by all accounts, he's a quality kid and a guy that you actually want in your class. And if it turns out that he gets on campus and just doesn't develop in year 1 or year 2, then you do what you keep doing and you keep churning at that position until you find the guy that's going to work for you. And they may have that guy already on their roster. A lot of guys, a lot of reports out of the spring were very positive about what they already have in terms of the true freshman. So yeah. But the other side to this too is they were 2-10 in 2024. Let's be real about this. Florida State was 2-10 in 2024 and has a budget in the 15 to 25 range in terms of teams nationally. They're not running around with top 5 money. They're not running around with top 10 money. Really, probably not in that top 15 zone. They're in that 15 to 25 range. And again, all of this is a little fuzzy because we don't have all of the contracts to be able to compare and all that. But, you know, the 2023 team was funded mostly by one major booster who basically seeded the Battle's End and got that all launched in order to try to get other people on board to do this. And you talk about really having vision of where the puck is going. Florida State was ahead of the game on all that. And that booster deserves a lot of credit for buying in and putting his money literally where his mouth was, and then not really saying a whole lot and staying in the shadows. But now the Battle's End depends on more distributed funding. You're not going to get the same kind of single Florida State doesn't have, you know, the oil money that, say, Texas Tech has to be able to just push multiple tens of millions out into the middle of the table. And it's just stuff that if they lose it, well, so what? Not a big deal. I mean, this is vacation money for some of these people. And, you know, when $10 million spent on a few prospects is just basically the equivalent of going on a vacation for you, then, well, you know, I guess it's your money. You can do with it what you want. But Florida State doesn't have a whole lot of those people. And all the programs that are spending top $10, top $5 especially, but all the programs that are spending top $10, they've got those kinds of people that are stepping in and doing that. Florida State's not going to have that advantage. So here's what I'm saying. You go 2-10 in 2024 and have a budget in the 15 to 25 range. What exactly are people expecting in terms of recruiting? I mean, are you really expecting Florida State to be a top 10, top 5 class when those are the headwinds that you're recruiting against? Given that situation, being 2-10 and then having that budget, that just means you're going to have to be better at evaluation, better at culture building, better at coaching, better at those other things. You're going to have to moneyball it in order to be able to compete, because Florida State is not Texas A&M, Ohio State, those programs in terms of what they're bringing to the table in terms of bidding. And I mean, look, they can put competitive bids out there for the guys that they really want, but when it comes down to it, they're not going to be able to outbid Ohio State for Jeremiah Smith or Texas Tech for basically anybody that Texas Tech decides to go all in on. But they can pick and choose. They're going to have to moneyball it. It's just what it is. Now, of course, the House settlement also passed since we last conversed or monologued, as I do on here. And I don't think it's accidental. I don't think it's completely coincidental that Florida State went on their recruiting run. Their surge in recruiting happened shortly after, almost immediately after the House settlement was approved. look, that's not entirely accidental. That's not entirely just a coincidence. A lot of programs over the last year have been engaged in front-loading contracts and emptying their coffers to some degree to make sure that they had maximized what was on their roster going into July of this year. They knew that there was a good chance that House would be approved and that there would be some changes to the way that things are done. Now, here's the other side to this. The House settlement is really limited in terms of the impact in the long haul that it's going to have, right? Programs are already finding ways around it. And, you know, the return of the bagman is going to come if this stuff starts to hold up. But the other thing is everybody in this space has been sort of aware that the restrictions that are being placed on collectives and on NIL in general, that's sort of the backbone of the House settlement. That stuff's not going to hold up. It's just not. Ultimately, when you have a situation like this where there are people who want to pay someone else for a service that is not illegal in terms of the law, and then you have someone else stepping in and saying, no, you can't pay that person. You can't give that person money. That person can't earn money that way. That's going to go to court again. Somebody's going to push for more legal guidance of that, and that's going to be that. Because it won't stand up. You're just not going to get in the long haul. I mean, eventually that goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has already been pretty clear about where they would go on this. And that is they're not going to license a restriction of trade. In order to get that done, you're going to have to collectively bargain. You're probably going to need a monopoly exemption, which is only going to come from Congress. You're going to get a Congress level monopoly exemption, and you're going to have to start handling players as employees in some sense. And the only way to work with that is some form of collective bargaining or something like that in order to try to preserve, in order to try to introduce, I would say preserve, but there's never been competitive balance in college football, in order to introduce some measure of competitive balance. It's the only way that's really in long haul. I mean, that's where it's going to have to go. But the House settlement has provided at least a small speed bump as there's been as everybody's tried to figure out where the guardrails are at present without legislation and without other court cases to kind of clearly define where this is, that it has sort of introduced a specific speed bump that I think has been beneficial to Florida State so far. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see recruiting the next couple of years in this respect, because the House settlement has just added complexity to the situation as you've gone from essentially the Wild West to a situation where people don't even really know what is going to be permissible and what is not in this sort of interim period where the House settlement is what's happening and, you know, sort of new norms are developing. And there's already, by the way, been an effort from the plaintiffs of the House settlement. They've already sent a 2-page letter to the NCAA and Power Conference officials, essentially warning the NCAA that they can't block some of the NIL deals that the College Sports Commission, which, you know, going through Deloitte, which that was put in place to be a clearinghouse for these deals, and they've rejected a number of deals. And the plaintiffs' attorneys have already come in and said, whoa, you can't just target collectives and say collectives can't pay these kids for this stuff. And of course, the conferences and the NCAA are saying we thought that was the purpose. So you see how this grift works from the attorney side. They just made something like $700 million in terms of the attorneys in fees from this case, and they're about to make a bunch more because they're going to now try to turn the tables and say, yeah, well, you thought that the deal was to restrict collectives and all that from being able to do that, but you can't just restrict collectives because that amounts to restraint of trade. We meant this kind of NIL deal, and, the market is the market. So the whole thing is sort of a little bit of a game there, right? It's going to work out ultimately that you're going to need to get some sort of legislative solution that's going to make this work with some sort of collective bargaining. And again, you're going to have some sort of monopoly exemption that would have to stand up there. It's the only way. Now, beyond that, another thing that has sort of stood out to me as I've been an observer to some of this discussion of Florida State coming into 2025 really has more to do with sort of what to expect in 2025. And one of the things that just keeps coming back to me as I'm looking at this and starting to evaluate, and I looking through some of the all 22 of the coordinators that they've just hired of prior stops, been working through some of the stuff from Florida State as well from last year, trying to assess, okay, look, what can we realistically expect? And one of the things that I've kind of concluded, one of my preliminary conclusions, and obviously I'm going to have to go through more and then bring that into play in the larger discussion when I do my season previews. But one of the things that I've preliminarily concluded is I just keep reminding myself of how easy it is to overreact based on prior results. We've all seen those, financial commercials or whatever, prior results are no guarantee of future performance. That's kind of where we are. And we talked a little bit about that last year before 2024, because we did talk about, well, they're losing a lot and there's a lot of moving pieces, and, the delta of what could happen is pretty big. Now, the delta was bigger than I think any of us thought, from the coaching staff to every media member. I mean, every one of us completely whiffed on what to expect. But shoot, I mean, if you listen to Nick Saban before the opener against Georgia Tech, he was talking about how impressive Florida State looked on the hoof, and, it was a really good football team and so on. And it turned out that was not a good football team, regardless of how impressive they were on the hoof, and regardless of whether they were the strongest in the weight room and the fastest on the track team that Mike Norvell had ever had. That was a bad football team. But ultimately, we all overestimated what they would be able to do after they had lost so much from the 2023 team. I mean, that's just reality. We overestimated it. It's like, well, look how good they were in 2023. They lost some stuff, but, they're still going to be really good. We know that this team's going to be really good because look what they've done the last 2 years. They're marching forward, steadily moving forward. Every year Mike Norvell's been at Florida State, they continue to take another step forward. So expect more regardless. Well, wrong. I was wrong. Everybody else was wrong. But here's the other thing. Virtually everything that could have gone wrong in 2024 for a football team did go wrong. So, we've all heard golfers talk about this, that, I hit it really well out there, but, I did not score as well as I hit it. Or, the opposite of, I squeezed the best score I could have out of how I hit it out there today. And, there's an aspect of, first of all, certain breaks that you get. Maybe you get a bounce this way or that, or, you just manage to compensate for one inadequacy with another. But sometimes you just manage to get the worst possible score out of how you played that you could. It's like I hit 6 bad shots in my entire round, and those 6 shots cost me 18 strokes or whatever, right? None of those shots put me in a position to do anything but really, really put a terrible score up there. That was kind of how Florida State's season was last year. There were inadequacies that if they'd had some other aspect that was able to compensate for it, they'd have been fine. But instead of one thing compensating for the other, it was the opposite. It was one thing. And again, this was our in-season theme last year. was just how one thing can reinforce another. That, you've got force multipliers where if you take a quarterback who doesn't get the ball out on time, who doesn't make quick decisions and doesn't throw with accuracy, and then you put him behind an offensive line that can't block, well, each of those two things actually makes the other worse. And then if you add to that wide receivers who consistently drop the football and miss every opportunity that they actually have when the ball is in their vicinity, then that's going to make that even worse. It's a force multiplier over and over and over again. And that's how this season went. Everything reinforced itself. So here's the thing. If you fix one thing, how much does that ripple effect help fix some of those other things? And, obviously with the players that they brought in, which we'll talk about here in future episodes, they tried to fix all of those things, but they put a big emphasis on the most important of those things. But even last year, as bad as that football team was, they win 5 or 6 games if they just catch the football in routine situations, or if they just don't pee down their leg in every key situation. So I'm reminded of the overthrow of the wide receiver in the corner of the end zone, just wide open against Boston College, followed immediately by Morlock letting the ball go right through his hands. You got 2 plays that would have been touchdowns. One's a terrible overthrow by the quarterback. The next is more or less on target, and it's dropped. Both of those are touchdowns, and you change the end result of that play, and Florida State may well win that game. You have a dropped throw in the end zone that from the best throw that Kromenhoek made all season, dropped in the end zone for a clear touchdown against Duke. You change the outcome of that play, Florida State wins that game. You've got a fumble going into the end zone against Florida. They still probably lose against Florida, but it's another great example of, you finally start to establish some momentum. You move the football, you get down, and you're getting ready to run right into the end zone on a run play, and the ball's on the turf on the 1.5 or 2 yard line. I mean, they did this over and over again last year. Everybody, we don't need to revisit this. But my point is, if you're a golfer and you go out there and you shoot the worst possible round you could ever shoot, you shoot a 94 or something like that, but you're still a 3 handicap. You go out and you shoot a 94 because everything just falls apart. You don't make any putts. You hit the ball out of bounds multiple times off the tee. Your distance control with your wedges is completely gone. And for some reason, you're pull hooking your irons. And so by the end of the round, you're just holding stuff together with duct tape and baling wire, and you're still not able to score. And you shoot a 94. Here's the question. You're a 3 handicap. What do you expect to go out and shoot the next time you play? You're able to work at things for another week. What do you expect to do? Well, you don't expect to shoot a 94 again. Probably as a 3 handicap, you're still probably not going to shoot an 85 or 94. 3 handicap, you're saying, well, I think if I just fix a couple things, I figured out what I was doing with my putting stroke and just keep the ball in bounds, I should be able to shoot in the maybe 78, 79 area. And you go, well, you just shot a 94. Well, I mean, I've had rounds where, I shot, back-to-back rounds this summer, shot a 35 and a 45. Back-to-back 9s. Well, so easy to overreact based on prior results. And I think Florida State last season was such a dramatic outlier that it's especially easy to overreact. And here's my hypothetical. If Florida State had gone 10-2 last year instead of 2-10, what would the expectation be with this exact roster and coaching staff? So nothing else is different about Florida State in terms of you've got a new coaching staff, in terms of offensive and defensive coordinators, several new position coaches, this exact roster, but Florida State went 10-2 last year. What would the expectation be with exactly the same players and coaching staff that you have now? How much would the discourse be different than it is now because they went 2-10. And I'll add another data point here. In terms of roster, Florida State's blue chip ratio this year is 54%. If you go to the, magic Bud Elliott blue chip roster, blue chip ratio on the roster thing, where, no team since 2011, when, he's basically keeping that data, no team since 2011 has won a national title without a blue chip ratio above 50%, which, by the way, probably may have changed if Jordan Travis doesn't break his leg in 2023. But no team has done that without a blue chip ratio above 54%. Florida State's above that threshold this year. And just for perspective, Clemson is at 55%, Tennessee also at 54%, Michigan at 57%, Miami at 64%. So what do you do when going into the season that Florida State has a 54% blue chip ratio going into the season, and that let's imagine that they went 10-2 last year? What's the expectation? Oh, by the way, Alabama still leading the nation together with Ohio State in blue chip ratio at 89%. So there's your season opener. So here's the thing. If you looked at this season and you said, okay, FSU went 10-2 last year, blue chip ratio 54%. You got Clemson, Florida, Miami, and Alabama on the schedule. Florida, by the way, 64% blue chip ratio. What's the expectation? And my guess is that most people looking at Florida State's schedule, looking at who they have on their roster, looking at the comparable talent and all of that, would say somewhere between 8-4 and 9-4, or not, it's 8-4 and 9-3 would be the expectation for Florida State. Because you're looking at one game where your blue chip ratio, where your roster strength is pretty comparable, and that's Clemson, and then 3 where you're at a disadvantage. Florida, Miami of Florida, and Alabama. So, and then you're at a pretty significant advantage over everybody else on your roster, or over everybody else on your schedule. So that's kind of what the expectation would be, and I submit that that's probably what the expectation should be. Now, some of that is contingent on quarterback, and I think Florida State has some questions there, with Tommy Castellanos being the main guy there. Obviously, you've got Sperry, you've got Brock Glenn as well on your roster. But there's more question marks at that ultra important position than what you would ideally like. But that's basically where things would be. And I suspect that that's where they should be. Somewhere around 8 wins, probably be about what you should expect. Because this roster, more talented than 8 of the teams on the schedule. It's close with a couple of them. And I think with this coaching staff, and this is the really interesting part, this coaching staff is going back to basics. They're going to run the football and stop the run. And if you can run the football and stop the run, you're going to be in good shape to win a lot of games that you should, and you'll probably be in position to win some games that you shouldn't. Go back to Auburn under Gus Malzahn. They always punched above their weight when they played against a more talented Alabama team. Why? Because Malzahn's offense can be a real female canine to deal with by a really good defense when he goes into it in a kitchen sink context. And Mike Norvell has historically punched above his weight in those kinds of contexts. So that's going to be interesting. But I look at this, in my view, there's only one opponent on the schedule that comes into the season, even with some of the advantages in terms of overall roster, there's only one opponent on the schedule that Florida State has that comes into the season without any real significant question marks in terms of roster, in terms of coaching turnover, or anything else. And that's Clemson. Interestingly, they're of the 4 teams that have a higher blue chip ratio than Florida State, Clemson's the closest of those, but I think they're the one that has the fewest question marks. They don't have a bunch of question marks. They've got one of the best quarterbacks in college football. They're returning 4 offensive linemen. They've got a bunch of returnees on defense. That's a team that I think it makes a lot of sense that they just don't have a lot of questions. They're going to be really good, and you pencil in a likely loss there. But Miami of Florida is talented, but they've got, I think, lots of question marks. You got a quarterback coming off Tommy John surgery. You got an offensive line that was good, but not elite last year. And I think they're going to be really good, potentially elite on the right side, but they've still got some moving pieces there. I think defensively, you've got a new defensive coordinator, and there's a whole bunch of stuff defensively that they got a bunch of transfers. They got a bunch of guys that they're going to have to figure out how they fit. There's some talent there. You expect them to be good, but how good? And how much of their success last year was Cam Ward on offense versus what they do on offense? How much would Beck not being Cam Ward potentially mean that they take a significant step back on offense, which I think may be likely? And if they're going to be a team that's going to depend on running the football, and you brought in Tony White and you brought in a bunch of guys to be a stop the run first defense, which last year Miami of Florida they were balanced, but they're going to run the football as well, playing against a Fuller defense that couldn't stop the run. And so you go into that game and you're able to stop the run on the season, and you're really able to give them trouble in terms of the running game. How much is that a winnable game? Don't know. Florida's got some questions. They've got the quarterback, but they also have, I think, questions around him. I think there's some significant questions there. Bama has arguably the most talent of any team in the country, but they've got significant questions at the quarterback position. Yes, a former 5-star, but has he really shown it so far? Not yet. Are they going to be able to run the football better than they did last year? Go and take a look at what happened against Michigan in the postseason exhibition game. Take a look at what happened when they played good defenses last year. They weren't able to run the football as well as what you would expect from a traditional Bama team. So if you can stop the run a little bit, how much does that change things? I tend to think that they're going to be better throwing it because Milroe, I think, got a lot more flowers than he should have. I would have rather played a Milroe led Alabama team this year, especially with Tony White and his emphasis on being able to stop the run. So, maybe pencil that one in as an unlikely win as well. But here's the thing. Norvell teams have overachieved in the opener since his arrival at Florida State. In the true opener. They had a couple of, they had the cupcake in 2023 before LSU. But in their true Power 5 opener, they've punched above their weight every year that Norvell's been there. And with Gus Malzahn, you can bet that they're going to have the kitchen sink ready. So maybe that game's at least in play to be competitive. That's kind of where things stand. So I think, the real question right now is, you get a lot of discussion of whether or not Florida State, whether this coaching staff is going to survive another year or two. I'm more bullish on it than I think the majority of the Florida State media are. And like I said, I'm kind of rooting for these guys just to be able to kind of drag some faces through it after going through some really difficult stuff. And, you wouldn't wish what happened, the corruption that happened at the end of 2023 on any program. Florida State's been pretty snake bitten the last 18 months. It's going to be interesting to see if they can turn that around. But I think there's more reason to be optimistic that the turnaround will be pretty significant this year than not. We'll see. We got to talk about the personnel and other things coming up. Start doing that here in the next episode. Get back to it soon. Nice to be back on the horse. Until then, this has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.